She left with a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, her mother's sewing shears, a Bible with Elias's handwriting in the margins, and $11. On that 4 years old, Marguerite Coulson stood alone on a dirt road outside Broken Wheel, Montana, with nothing left of her name but a battered carpetbag and $11 sewn into the hem of her skirt. Her late husband's brother, Ambrose Coulson, had turned her out of the family ranch not 3 days after the funeral, claiming the land had never rightfully belonged to a woman who would only married into it. What little she had left after selling her mother's silver was $11, and with it, she did something the whole town would call foolish. She bought the old Prairie Row Saloon at auction, a collapsing wreck nobody else would touch, boarded up for a decade, its roof half caved in. She paid $4 for it, barely enough to cover the county's back taxes. Everyone said she'd wasted her last cent on a pile of rotting lumber and ghosts. But sealed behind that saloon's warped old bar was something no one in Broken Wheel had seen in 12 years, a secret that would not only save Marguerite, but resurrect a town everyone had already given up for dead. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marguerite Coulson. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're joining us from tonight. Marguerite had not always been a woman without a home. She was born in 1858 in a modest farmhouse outside Bozeman, the third of 5 children to a blacksmith father and a mother who took in mending to stretch the family's thin means further. From her father, Thomas Hale, she learned patience, the kind of patience that comes from watching iron refuse to bend until it is heated exactly right, coaxed rather than forced. From her mother, Ruth, she learned the deeper patience of restoration, how to take a torn coat, a broken chair, a cracked plate, and make it whole again, not through magic but through attention, through refusing to believe that damage meant worthless. Nothing is finished being useful until you've truly looked at it, her mother used to say, turning a threadbare shirt collar inside out to reveal the good cloth hidden beneath the worn one. Marguerite carried that lesson through every hard season of her life, though she could not have known, as a girl of 10 sitting at her mother's knee, how literally it would one day save her. She married young, at 19, to a quiet, steady man named Elias Coulson, a rancher's son with kind eyes and a laugh that came slow but full. Elias's family had homesteaded near Broken Wheel since before the town had a name worth speaking, and when Marguerite came to live on the Coulson ranch, she came not as a stranger but as someone eager to belong. She learned to mend fences alongside the hired hands, to doctor sick cattle, to preserve that would last a hard winter, and to keep the ranch's ledgers with precision that impressed even her skeptical father-in-law. Elias's younger brother, Ambrose, resented her from the start, resented that Elias, and not he, had inherited their father's trust, and resented, too, the quiet competence with which Marguerite ran the household accounts. He was a man who measured his own worth by what he could take from others, and for 22 years, Elias's steady presence kept that hunger in check. Marguerite and Elias never had children of their own, a private grief they carried together without ever needing to speak of it aloud, and instead poured their care into the land, into their neighbors, into the small rituals of a marriage built on mutual respect rather than romance alone. She learned carpentry from watching Elias repair the barn, learned enough of masonry to rebuild a chimney after a bad storm, and above all, she learned the particular Montana virtue of never complaining about hardship you could instead simply fix. The townsfolk of Broken Wheel came to know her as capable and showy, the sort of woman who would appear at your door with a covered dish and a spare pair of hands without ever being asked. She built a quiet reputation, brick by brick, the same way she built everything else in her life, carefully and to last. Then, in the spring of 1902, Elias fell from a horse while checking a fence line during a hailstorm, struck his head on a fence post, and died 3 days later without ever fully waking. Marguerite's grief was a private, enormous thing, but she had little time to sit inside it. Within the week, Ambrose Coulson had produced a will, one Marguerite had never seen, dated years earlier, before Elias had ever married her, naming Ambrose sole inheritor of the ranch should Elias die without children. Whether the document was genuine or conveniently rediscovered, no lawyer in the county seemed willing to say, and Marguerite, exhausted by grief and unwilling to drag her husband's memory through a public fight, did not have the resources to challenge it. Ambrose gave her 3 days to gather her belongings. He did not offer her a wagon. He did not offer her a single dollar the herd's worth, though she had helped build that herd from 40 head to 400 over 2 decades of unpaid labor. He told her, without meeting her eyes, that a woman without children had no true claim to a dead man's legacy. Inheritance. Money she had quietly saved a coin at a time from egg sales over the years. Money Ambrose did not know existed, and therefore could not take. She walked the 11 miles into Broken Wheel proper with that carpet bag growing heavier with every mile, and she did not cry, not because she felt nothing, but because crying was a luxury for women who still had somewhere soft to land. She found a room above the mercantile that Bertram Osgood, the storekeeper, let her have for $1 a week, and she sat on the narrow bed that first night with her $11 spread across the quilt, doing arithmetic that refused to come out in her favor no matter how she rearranged it. Broken Wheel itself was a town on the edge of vanishing. The railroad spur that had once been promised to run through it had gone instead to Larkspur Junction, 12 miles east, and in the 7 years since, half the storefronts on Main Street had gone dark. The Prairie Rose Saloon, once the liveliest building in town, had closed the same year the railroad decision was announced. Its owner, a broken man named Cyrus Whitlock, who had put every dollar he owned into betting the spur would come through his town, and who had disappeared one autumn night, leaving debt, an empty till, and a building nobody wanted. The county had held the deed for over a decade, unable to sell it, unwilling to tear it down, and the Prairie Rose sat on Main Street like a missing tooth in an already thinning smile, its windows boarded, its sign faded to a ghost of red paint, a standing reminder of the town's dashed hopes. The county auction was announced almost as an afterthought, tacked to the notice board outside the courthouse alongside notices of unpaid taxes and stray livestock. Marguerite saw the notice on a gray Tuesday morning while fetching thread for Bertram in exchange for a few cent credit, and something in her, perhaps her mother's old voice, perhaps simple desperation, made her stop and read it twice. The auction was set for that Saturday. The reserve price was $4, a number so low it embarrassed a county clerk to write it, $4 being less than the cost of the nails that had gone into the building's original construction. Nobody in town believed the Prairie Rose was worth saving. It had become, in the collective imagination of Broken Wheel, not a building at all but a symbol of the railroad that never came, of the town's slow bleeding out, of everything that had been promised and then taken away. On Saturday, a small crowd gathered outside the courthouse more out of habit than genuine interest, men in from ranches or supplies, a few boys hoping for excitement, the county auctioneer, a florid man named Auctioneer Del Pruitt, standing on an overturned crate. When the Prairie Rose came up for bid, Pruitt called the reserve of $4 and was met with silence so complete that a dog barking 2 streets over seemed loud. He called it again. Someone laughed. Not unkindly, just a particular laugh of a town that had learned to find dark humor in its own decline. Marguerite, standing at the edge of the small crowd with her shawl pulled tight against the autumn chill, felt her own hand rise before her mind had entirely agreed to it. $4, she said, and her voice, though not loud, carried in the stillness. Pruitt blinked at her. The crowd turned, and Ambrose Coulson, who happened to be in town that day for supplies of his own, let out a short, ugly laugh that everyone heard. "The widow's buying herself a coffin," he said to the man beside him, not troubling to lower his voice, and a few people laughed along with him, though not all, and Marguerite kept her chin level and did not look at him at all. Nobody else bid. The gavel came down. $4. Marguerite Coulson owned the Prairie Rose Saloon, and she owned, along with it, the whispered certainty of nearly everyone in Broken Wheel that grief had finally cracked her good sense. She did not go inside that first day. She stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon's boarded facade with a deed folded in her coat pocket, and she let herself simply look at it, the way her mother had taught her to look at a torn coat before deciding whether to mend or discard. The building was not beautiful. Its false front had once been painted a proud crimson, now faded to the color of old rust, and the boards across its windows were gray and swollen with weather. But its bones, she noted, were sound. The roofline was true, the foundation showed no visible sag, and whoever had built it to last through Montana winters, which was more than could be said for half the newer structures on Main Street. She went inside 2 days later, prying loose one board at a time with a crowbar borrowed from Bertram, and the door, when it finally gave way, released a breath of stale air, dust, and something underneath the dust that smelled faintly, strangely, of cedar. The interior was a ruin of a different kind than she'd expected, not collapse, but frozen, as though Cyrus Whitlock had simply walked out one evening mid-thought and never returned. Chairs still sat upright at tables thick with dust. A deck of cards lay fanned across the bar as though a hand had been dealt and abandoned. Bottles, long empty of anything but dust and dead moths, stood in their rows behind the bar like a congregation waiting for a sermon that would never come. Marguerite moved through the space slowly, cataloging what could be salvaged and what could not, the way she had once cataloged the damage after a bad hailstorm on the ranch. The long mahogany by itself, however, drew her attention in a way she could not immediately explain. It ran the length of the room, its surface scarred with cigarette burns and the rings of 1,000 forgotten drinks, but it was rich and dark, clearly imported at some expense, entirely out of proportion to the modesty of the rest of the building. Someone had spent real money on this bar, she thought, running her palm along its edge, and men do not spend real money without a reason. It was while clearing debris from beneath the bar's overhang, on her third day of work, that her hand found something the dust had been hiding, a seam in the wood paneling along the bar's back wall that did not quite match the grain running beside it, a seam too straight, too deliberate, to be simple wear. She knelt in the dim light filtering through the gaps in the boarded windows and pressed her palm flat against the panel, and it gave, very slightly, under pressure, in a way that solid wood should not. Her heart, she would later admit, had begun to beat harder before her mind had even finished forming the thought that this might be exactly what it seemed. She spent the better part of an hour working the panel loose with a chisel borrowed alongside the crowbar, careful not to splinter what might be a door rather than damage, and when it finally came free, it revealed not a wall behind it, as she'd expected, but a shallow compartment, perhaps 2 feet deep in the full width of the bar, built into the very structure of the building itself, clearly constructed at the same time as a bar rather than added later. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, she found a strong box, iron-cornered and heavier than she expected, its lock long rusted but not, she discovered when she worked at it with a hairpin and considerable patience, entirely beyond opening. What she found inside would take her the rest of that evening, and much of the next several days, to fully understand. Not gold, not the treasure that a lesser story might have promised, but something in its way far more valuable to a town that had lost its future, a leather ledger, water-stained but legible, and beneath it, folded with obvious care, a set of surveyor's documents bearing the seal of the Northern Territorial Land Office, dated 1893, 9 years before Cyrus Whitlock had vanished. Marguerite carried the strong box's contents up to her small room above the mercantile that night, and spread them across a narrow bed by lamplight, reading with the same careful attention her mother had taught her to give a torn seam. The ledger, she came to understand over several evenings of patient decoding, was Cyrus Whitlock's private accounting, not of the Saloon's modest trade, but of a much larger and more secretive enterprise. Whitlock, it emerged, had been quietly buying up mineral rights and water rights across dozens of parcels surrounding Broken Wheel throughout the early 1890s, using the Saloon as his base of operations and, apparently, his hiding place for the deeds and documents that proved these purchases. The surveyor's report explained why. A geological survey, commissioned privately by Whitlock and never made public, indicated substantial coal deposits beneath land that ran along the very route the railroad had been expected to take before the spur was diverted to Larkspur Junction instead. The story that emerged, piece by piece, from those brittle pages was this. Cyrus Whitlock had gambled everything not on the Saloon trade at all, but on the certainty that the railroad would come through Broken Wheel, and had spent years quietly acquiring the mineral rights beneath the town and its surrounding ranches for pennies on the dollar, intending to sell them at enormous profit once the rail line made the coal accessible and valuable. When the railroad decision went instead to Larkspur Junction, a decision the ledger suggested, in careful, coded entries, had been influenced by a bribe paid to a territorial rail commissioner by a rival speculator, Whitlock's entire fortune had evaporated overnight. He had sealed his document behind the bar. Marguerite came to believe, not out of cowardice but out of a broken man's last flicker of hope, that he might return one day, when circumstances changed, and reclaim what he bought. He never did. Whether he had died somewhere on the road, or simply started over under a different name in a different territory, the ledger could not say, and Marguerite found she did not particularly wish to know. What mattered was what the documents proved, clear as daylight once she understood how to read them. Cyrus Whitlock, however dishonestly his fortune had been built, had legally and rightfully owned mineral rights beneath at least a dozen parcels of land around Broken Wheel, rights that, under territorial law regarding unclaimed property and abandoned estates, now belonged to whoever held clear title to the Prairie Row Saloon. The building in which those rights had been formally recorded and stored, since no other claimant had come forward in over a decade. She did not fully grasp, in those first days. The scale of what she'd found, that beneath the collapsing town of Broken Wheel lay a coal, seemed substantial enough to interest not merely local buyers but the territorial rail company itself. Now, 9 years later, finally extending a new spur westward to serve exactly the kind of industrial development those deposits represented. But she grasped enough, poring over the documents by lamplight with her mother's old patience guiding her hands, to understand that she was holding something far more significant than a curiosity from a dead man's failed dream. She was holding, quite possibly, the means to save a town that had already resigned itself to dying. Word traveled quickly in a town small enough that everyone's business is everyone's business, and it did not take long for whispers to begin about what the widow Coulson was doing, alone, inside the old prairie rose at all hours, with lamplight burning late behind boarded windows. Bertram Osgood, discreet as he was, could not help but notice that Marguerite had begun asking pointed questions at the land office in Larkspur Junction, questions about mineral rights and territorial recording statutes that a woman with no evident purpose would have no reason to ask. And it was Ambrose Coulson, of all people, passing through Broken Wheel on ranch business, who first put together enough pieces to grow suspicious. Watching Marguerite emerge from the land office with a folder of documents held tight against her chest and an expression he did not recognize on her face. Not grief anymore, but something closer to purpose. Ambrose had never forgiven Marguerite for the small, stubborn dignity with which he'd accepted his cruelty rather than fighting him publicly, and he had certainly never forgiven himself the discomfort of knowing, in whatever quiet corner of conscience he still possessed, that what he'd done to her had not been entirely honest. When he learned, through the particular alchemy of small-town gossip mixed with his own inquiries at the land office, that the old Whitlock mineral claims might still be legally valid, and that Marguerite Coulson, of all people, appeared to be positioning herself to claim them, something in him curdled into active opposition. He began, quietly at first and then with less subtlety, to spread word that the widow Coulson was engaged in some kind of fraud, that she'd found the dead man's papers and meant to swindle honest ranchers out of rights to their own land, that no decent town should trust a woman who bought a haunted saloon with her dead husband's memory barely cold. The opposition might have ended there. May ugly talk, had Ambrose not taken the further step of riding to Helena to consult a territorial land attorney of his own, a sharp-eyed man named Judge Aldous Merrick, no relation to any bench despite the title he preferred, who specialized in precisely the kind of contested claims that Whitlock's abandoned rights now represented. Merrick's counsel to Ambrose was simple and cynical. If the mineral rights truly were as valuable as the survey suggested, there was money to be made in challenging Marguerite's claim to them, regardless of the legal merits, simply by making the process expensive and exhausting enough that a widow with no resources would eventually be forced to sell her interest cheap rather than fight. Ambrose, who had learned patience only in the pursuit of taking what others had built, found this counsel entirely to his taste, and within a fortnight, Broken Wheel found itself host to a formal legal challenge disputing Marguerite Coulson's claim to the Whitlock mineral rights on the grounds that, as a widow without direct blood claim to her late husband's estate, the same grounds, with bitter irony, that Ambrose had used to disinherit her in the first place, she lacked standing to inherit, or claim any property whatsoever, including a saloon bought with her own money at public auction. The town, which had spent a decade believing itself forgotten by fortune, now found itself abruptly and uncomfortably divided. Some, like Bertram Osgood, stood by Marguerite without hesitation, remembering 2 decades of quiet kindness and unwilling to believe her capable of the fraud Ambrose implied. Others, frightened by the prospect that their own land might somehow be entangled in the dispute, or simply suspicious of a widow's sudden fortune, sided cautiously with Ambrose, or at least declined to take Marguerite's part too loudly. The dispute dragged through the autumn and into the hard edge of winter, with Marguerite spending what little money she had on filing fees and traveled to Larkspur Junction to consult the one land attorney willing to take her case on the promise of future payment, a young, earnest man named Silas Torrey, who found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, genuinely moved by the justice of her claim. The turning point came not in a courtroom, which Broken Wheel did not properly possess, but in the territorial land office in Larkspur Junction on a bitter January morning, before a visiting circuit judge brought in specifically to settle the matter, given its now considerable stakes. Judge Merrick, representing Ambrose's interests, argued with practiced condescension that Marguerite's claim rested on nothing more than a dead man's abandoned papers found by chance, papers with no legal standing, discovered by a woman whose only true qualification was persistence rather than proper inheritance. Marguerite, when her turn came, did not argue emotion. She laid out, in the same careful, methodical manner with which he had once kept the Coulson Ranch's ledgers, the full chain of documentation. The original auction deed proving clear title to the Prairie Rose Saloon in her name alone, the territorial recording seal on Whitlock Surveyor's report, proving the mineral rights had been properly filed under law regardless of how quietly, and, most decisively, a statute Silas Torrey had unearthed after weeks of research, stating plainly that unclaimed property recorded and physically stored within a structure for a period exceeding 10 years, with no competing claim filed, passed by law to whoever held clear and undisputed title to that structure. She had held clear title to the Prairie Rose for 4 months. Whitlock's papers had sat unclaimed for over a decade. The law, dry and unromantic as it was, stood entirely on her side, and the circuit judge, after 2 hours of deliberation that felt to Marguerite like the longest of her life, ruled accordingly. What followed was not, as a lesser story might tell it, a sudden windfall of gold coins spilling across Marguerite's narrow bed, but something slower and, in its way, more meaningful. The Territorial Rail Company, extending its new spur westward precisely as the old surveys had predicted, approached Marguerite within weeks of the ruling with an offer to lease the coal rights beneath Broken Wheel and the surrounding parcels, an offer substantial enough to have changed the circumstances entirely on its own. But Marguerite, remembering her mother's hands turning a worn collar inside out to find the good cloth beneath, did not think only of her own restoration. She understood, with a particular clarity of a woman who had lost everything and been forced to rebuild it from nothing, exactly what the town around her needed most. She structured the lease, with Silas Torrey's careful legal guidance, so that a portion of every dollar paid for the coal beneath Broken Wheel would flow not only to her but into a trust for the town itself, funding the rebuilding of the very main street that had stood half empty for 7 years, and guaranteeing, at her insistence, that the rail company's new spur would run directly through Broken Wheel rather than bypassing it a second time. The rebuilding that followed through that spring and summer transformed Broken Wheel in ways that would have seemed impossible to the small, mocking crowd gathered outside the courthouse the previous autumn. New lumber arrived by wagon and, before long, by rail. Storefronts long dark reopened. Families who had been preparing to leave for Larkspur Junction or points further west found reason, suddenly, to stay. And the Prairie Rose Saloon itself, at Marguerite's direction, was not rebuilt as a saloon at all, but restored as something the town had never had and badly needed, a proper meeting hall and lending library, its long mahogany bar, the very bar that had held Cyrus Whitlock's secret for over a decade, reproposed as a library's main circulation desk, polished until its old scars caught the light rather than hid within it. As for Ambrose Coulson, his justice came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, grinding mechanism of consequence catching up with a man who had built his fortune on other people's losses. His legal challenge, once dismissed, left him not only without the mineral rights he'd hoped to seize, but publicly exposed, through Silas Torrey's careful documentation presented to the circuit judge, as a man who had forged or at minimum conveniently produced the original while disinheriting his own brother's widow. The Coulson Ranch, already strained by Ambrose's poor management in the years since Elias's death, could not withstand the scandal alongside the legal cost of a failed challenge, and within 2 years, Ambrose was forced to sell off parcels of the very land he'd once claimed a woman had no right to inherit, eventually leaving the county altogether. His name spoken in Broken Wheel thereafter with a particular quiet contempt reserved for men who are remembered for exactly what they did. It is worth returning, now, to where this story began, to a woman standing alone on a dirt road with a carpetbag and $11, cast out by a man who believed a widow's labor and loyalty counted for nothing against blood and paper. Marguerite Coulson did not find fortune inside that collapsing saloon by luck alone, though luck played its part, as it does in every life. She found it because she had spent her whole life practicing the particular discipline her mother had taught her at a mending basket decade before, the discipline of looking closely at what others had already discarded, and asking, patiently, whether it was truly finished being useful. The Prairie Rose Saloon was not a coffin, as Ambrose had cruelly joked, but neither was it simply a lucky vessel for buried treasure. It was, in the end, exactly what Marguerite had always been herself, something the world had written off too quickly, something whose real value lay not on the surface where anyone might see it, but underneath, waiting for someone patient enough and kind enough to look. Marguerite Coulson lived the remainder of her long life in Broken Wheel, in a modest house on a street that no longer stood half empty, and she could be found most afternoons at the library circulation desk, the old bar's dark mahogany worn smooth now by decades of borrowed books rather than poured whiskey, helping the town's children find whatever it was they were looking for, and often, without quite meaning to, teaching them the same lesson her mother had once taught her. Thank you for spending this time with Marguerite's story, and with us. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.